both ends now. YouTube is lying to me again. It says we've got no viewers. I know that won't be the case.
Hi, Ollie. Hi, Ollie.
Cool. All right. Well, yeah. I guess we can kind of
Yep.
start from there, mate.
Okay, cool.
People will drop in.
So, welcome. If anyone's watching, we've got a slight issue, so we can't tell how many people are watching. We're hoping it's more than zero. Um, Welcome to second running of this session. So if you missed the webinar this morning, then we're just repeating that now. And I'm Ollie Kenchington, and I'm going to be talking through, mastering colour, which those of you who are familiar with the stuff that I have out there, particularly on MZ, may recognise the name. Mastering Colour is actually the title of my colour grading masterclass that I have on MZ. I'm not doing that. That's like 6 or 7 hours long. I'm not going to try and shoehorn that into 2 hours. Well, actually, no, I am going to try and shoehorn that kind of. So we're going to cover the same topics. I've actually deliberately arranged it more or less into similar kind of headings, but we're going to do like a little a shortened version of it. And just, yeah, kind of get people a bit more familiar with some of the major processes of the color grading workflow. I'm going to be using some stuff from Canon C200. So we're looking at some cinema raw light stuff. So in a minute, we'll cut to my Resolve interface and we'll talk about some of the main kind of workflow steps that you would go through with normalizing and color grading and then adding a creative look at the end. And I wanted to start off, though, in the same way that my Mastering Colour MZ course does. I wanted to start by talking about your setup, your color grading suite setup, or your office setup, or your edit suite setup for that odd time when you color. And I think it's really important. It's very important that you manage your environment when you're looking at color and trying to work with color. And it's also important what you can and can't do within the constraints of your space and your budget, and depending on how far you're going. And there's kind of like the strict kind of color grading setup, and then there's the kind of the shortcuts that you can take, as long as you know that they're shortcuts that hopefully make it a little bit more accessible. My fear is that if you sort of just say to people, this is technically how you set up a color grading suite, so much of it will just seem out of reach that people just not bother. And I'd far rather that you took some of these steps and sort of got into a space where you're better than where you were, than just thinking, well, it's beyond my reach and I'll just forget about it. Just broadly, actually, before I dive into that, this whole so the Mastering Color course and what I'm going to be talking about today, they are the course is very much kind of developed around a central idea of making it sort of semi-timeless. So it's not tied to any specific software at all. Definitely no version of any software, but not any software platform itself at all. I'm going to happen to be using DaVinci Resolve. You can use whatever you like, whatever software you like to make your color adjustments. I'm talking about kind of headline workflow steps, balancing contrast, balancing color. The tools that I'm using are predominantly available in most platforms. So don't worry about the fact I'm using Resolve. This isn't about Resolve. This is about the color grading process and the normal kind of workflow that one goes through. And Mastering Color itself was kind of written from the point of view of being software agnostic and really about the workflow and the practice of color grading rather than the specifics of how to use the software, which is why there are separate courses for Mastering Color about the color grading workflow, and then a separate course for Resolve. We've actually got two. Actually, the second one just went live yesterday. So there's the definitive guide to DaVinci Resolve, which is like a overview, a very sort of beginner level overview of the whole software, from the audio features to the compositing and motion graphics features to delivery and everything in between, and editing. And then I've literally just yesterday just gone live with the color correction with DaVinci Resolve, which is just specifically focused on the color page within DaVinci Resolve. And it's as long as the definitive guide, but just about the color page. So it's far bigger deep dive on that particular topic. But This is why I've done separate Resolve courses, and then there's a separate Master in Colour. They're sort of almost timeless things, and with Master in Colour, and actually that all stemmed from when I was sort of starting out and looking at various different resources out there to kind of inform my practices as a colourist. There was a fantastic book by Alexis van Herkman called The Colourist's Handbook, and it took a similar approach, and it's something that resonated with me. It says right at the outset, Alexis makes it clear it's not about the software, it's about the workflow, and it's about the processes that one goes through to set up and appraise. And so I tried to make Master in Colour similarly not software specific. So having said that, if you have specific software questions, chuck them in the comments. We've got comments on YouTube, we've got comments on Discord, we've got comments on Zoom. So there's plenty of different places wherever you are to post questions and comments, and I'll try and deal with those at the end when we do a Q&A. But just broadly, what we're trying to do here is touch on things that will make you better at looking at, appraising, and altering the color and contrast of your films, which is the goal. So, as I said, I'll cut to Resolve in a minute, but let's start off by talking about your setup, where you're going to be looking at color. It's very important when you're looking at the color and contrast of your captured content on your monitor. It's very important that you make certain changes, some harder than others, but certain changes to your environment. One of the first things to talk about is the lighting aspects, the light that's coming into your space. Hopefully this looks relatively natural, the setup that you're seeing here, but at the moment all we've got on actually is just one light, which is set to 6,500 Kelvin, and this is the same light source that we use when we're illuminating the grading suite here for a color session. And that number 6,500 is really important because that's the white point of all Rec 709 calibrated monitors. So every device that you, and more importantly your viewers, look at your content on, unless it's one of these annoying phones that has these true tone displays that after sundown they whack up orange and to stop you from not sleeping properly. That's fine if you're not going to be critically appraising the color, but that does dramatically change the white point of the screen. Apart from those situations, almost every screen you ever see will have a white point of 6,500 Kelvin. And that D65 is part of the Rec 709 specification. And so our eyes aren't tuning to the wrong color temperature, and they stay latched to the color temperature of the white point of our monitor. We just simply have to make sure that the light source in our studio, in our space, whether that's a spare room or an office space or anything that you're working in, that the color temperature matches. So we actually use multi-purpose. We use light panels, Gemini lights. They're very high CRI, something like 98 or 99, I think, for daylight. So we just tune those to 6,500 Kelvin. And point them up. We have diffusion on them, and we literally just set the level. And the level of illumination is also important. You don't want a direct light source in your line of sight. So actually, the way I have it now is obviously to light me, so it's directly in my line of sight. I wouldn't want that if I was color grading. We actually hide it out of sight, turn it up, let it bounce off the grey walls, and then just fill the room with an ambient level of light. And the intensity of that light should be around about 10%. As bright as your monitor when your monitor is displaying pure white. And in turn, that pure white on that monitor would be at 100 nits if it was configured for a standard Rec 709 grade. That 100 nits is really important. As with Gamma 2.4, that's your standard Rec 709 reference level for monitoring, and so our ambient light is meant to be about 10% of that brightness. Now, this is where there needs to be a certain amount of kind of common sense about this. If you can't afford to tie up, £3,500 lights for color accuracy in your environment, then just get the next best thing you can. And I do think that, like I said at the beginning, if you're doing something, it's better than nothing at all. So one of the things that you can do, which we've got here, And in fact, I bought these to demonstrate exactly this for mastering color. These are little, they're about £3, I think, about £2 or £3 off Amazon. These are LED 6,500 Kelvin daylight bulbs. And in mastering color, I put them in these little diffuse glass balls. Let's see if I can get that on screen. There we go. To diffuse it, and if you hide them away from your eye line, sort of dot them places. We've got a couple of them. You can do that. So they're quite the drawback here is that they're not high TLCI or CRI. I think they're high 80s. They're not hideous, but ideally you'd want at least 90 or high 90s if you can get them. So depending on how color critical the work you're doing is, that might not be good enough. But I suspect that if you're just, turning off all your lights and there's a little bit of daylight creeping in, or even worse, you've got like in an office with some overhead fluoros that you just leave on, anything is better compared to that. So it might be worth looking at those bulbs or something similar. The other thing to bear in mind is that you do need to black out any light sources that are changing over time or are not matching that 6,500. So daylight occasionally is 6,500. In fact, 6,500 came about because it's the average daylight color temperature in Northern Europe, but that's an average. It's changing all the time. So you do need to black out any daylight. So we've got a massive window on one side of our studio here, which is great, particularly with all the wonderful weather we're having, but unfortunately we have to black it all out. So that's we've got a blind and a permanent blackout, so that's stopping any daylight from coming in, or the vast majority of it. There's a tiny bit that creeps in at the bottom, but I'm not too fussy about that. Obviously, as I said, if you have like dodgy overhead fluoros in an office space, try and kill them if you can't turn them off, because you might be in like a co-working space where the lighting is all set across the whole floor, for example, or the whole building. Then get some cinefoil or some black wrap and wrap it around there and try and cut that light source out as best as you can, or just take the bulbs out and just don't tell them that I did it. You might get in trouble. Check your lease. Check the terms of your lease first. So from a color point of view, that color and light temperature point, what am I saying? Color temperature and light intensity point of view, that should set you up fairly well. The other thing to do, and again, you could do this kind of the cheapy way or the not cheapy way, but anything's better than just leaving your walls as they are, is we have all of our walls here painted with a completely pigment-free specialist color reference suite paint. It's made by a company called GTI. It's about £150 for a very small tin, but it's quite thin. It goes a long way. We used about half a tin to this entire space here. And that just means that when the light that we are filling this space with, when it hits the walls and bounces back as it will, that spill isn't tinted. And this is, again, like where we go between like a proper color calibrated suite, like we have here, where we're really, really making sure that the integrity of the quality of the light itself, and if the light hits the walls and bounces back, there aren't any pigments in that paint that are going to tint that light that's reflecting back to us. But if you just went to B&Q and got some plain grey paint, it's better than, say, if you're doing it in a room that's got red walls or white walls or green walls, but it's still going to have pigment on it in it if it's just a paint from B&Q or Homebase. And that you'll see that when they mix up the paint, it's a white base, and then you'll see them squirt loads of colours in and then mix it up. And then a subtractive colour model that gets you towards black and gets you this grey, but it still has pigments to do that. Whereas this GTI paint is actually like a clear base with graphite mixed into it, and so it is a pure pigment-free grey that you're putting on the walls. It might be difficult. You might not be able to paint the walls, and in fact, in case that was your excuse, it's no excuse, because we weren't allowed to paint the walls here either. And so what we did is we meticulously cut out long sheets of canvas and took out the screws. We couldn't even screw them to the wall, so we took out the screws that were holding the I think it's like chipboard that's on the walls here, and stretched the canvas out and then screwed them back in. So we've literally made no impact on the space, and if we were to ever leave, we could just take them down and you'd never know it was like this. So we actually painted canvas and put it in blocks across the whole room. And then there were tiny little gaps between the sheets, about 1 centimetre. So we then got doweling and then painted that with the grey paint and then pushed that into the edges as well. So there's basically a completely smooth grey finish on all the walls. You don't have to do that. But if you are unable to paint your walls, one thing that you could do, and in fact, I demonstrate this in the first episode. In fact, the first episode is free, so you could see this without even having to pay for it. In Mastering Colour on MZ, the first thing I do is actually demonstrate using some old polyboard. So most rental houses actually have old disused polyboard that's maybe got dulled, maybe it's got muddy or messed up. And it's affecting how it reflects light. So they're no good, they're used, they're seconds. And actually most of them will sell those seconds. Sometimes they're in really good condition and they're only a couple of quid. I think in the episode I picked up one that was like an 8x4 polyboard and painted one side of it with this paint, just a little roller. And I think it cost something like 10 quid. It was nothing. And because it's so big, and an 8x4, when it's a metre and a half, 2 meters away from you, it actually fills most of your periphery of your vision. It's so light because it's polyboard, you can literally just sort of slip it behind your monitor and just sit it on the desk. Or again, because it's so light, you could just you could edge it with double-sided tape and just stick it to the wall. There's all kinds of various solutions. The key thing is that the area behind your monitor is this neutral grey as possible. If you want to, you can even go the extra step of getting bias lighting, which is lighting that you put around the back of your monitor. And it means that there's a nice equal amount of illumination behind the monitor, which again is the similar intensity as the other ambient light. So if you have an ambient light source and nothing behind your monitor, then you get a dark shadow behind the monitor. And then comparatively, everything on your screen looks lighter than it really is. You can get bias lighting they're just little strips of sticky LEDs. We use ones by a company called Media Lighting, which are very high TLCI, 6500, and we've got them around our client monitor actually, because behind my reference monitor I don't have anything. There's just air. There's nothing for it to bounce off, but we have it around our client monitor, which is a big 55-inch OLED. So it means that your perception of the brightness of what you're grading is consistent, basically. So I think there's a lot there that can be realistic in terms of your actual hardware. Get the fastest computer you can, get a decent GPU in there. Always prioritize your GPU over RAM and things like that, because it will make more of a difference for color. Ideally, you want 3 monitors. So you want one for your user interface with all your tools in it. You want one for your scopes, so dedicated just for your scopes. And then you want one as a reference, which is a calibrated monitor, which adheres to the standard that you're delivering to. And I guarantee there'll be loads of questions about what monitors we recommend. Do they have to be calibrated? Why should I bother calibrating? People aren't watching it with calibrated screens. We can deal all with that at the Q&A at the end. But you can be flexible. So for example, we don't have a completely separate monitor just for our scopes. We do in essence, but we've kind of like doubled up. So in fact, we've got an iPad Pro, and which will go out and about with me, and I use it when we're doing recce's and stuff, and got making notes on it. But when we're in the suite, I use that using the screen sharing feature on my Mac to send the scopes out from Resolve. So it's about 45, 50 centimeters away from me, 13-inch screen, nearly 13-inch screen. It's big enough to have all of the scopes on there. So kind of getting multi-purpose use out of that. Or if you just have, with the scopes, it can be anything. If you've got some dodgy old monitor you don't use, or an old one that's kicking around, you can use anything for your scopes. User interface, we actually have an ultra wide monitor for our user interface, because with the timelines, it helps having that really wide monitor. And then when it comes to the reference, obviously get the best quality monitor you can. We'll probably deal with that separately in the Q&A afterwards, because I know there'll be a lot of questions about that. As for where they are, ideally, again, this is like strictly speaking in a color suite, you would have your reference monitor directly ahead of you. So we've got the Blackmagic mini panel here. So the mini panel, and you would have that reference monitor directly in front of you. And that connects your eyes and your hands to exactly the image that you're seeing. And then your user interface would be off to the side. I personally don't do that because our suite is multi-purpose. We're editing from here. You know, unfortunately, we don't have the budget to have an entirely separate system just for color, and it never gets touched for anything else. So, you know, we're doing everything from this machine. And although it's a slight compromise when we're grading, it's only a relatively minor compromise. But it means that, you know, for example, at the moment, I'm doing loads of editing. And if I'm having to edit and permanently look at 45 degrees at my user interface monitor, then, you know, I've done it. It bloody hurts. You really end up damaging your neck. So, you know, that's up to you. It depends whether it's dedicated for just color use or not. But it doesn't make a huge difference. I think probably most people watching this are in a multi-use environment where you're editing as well. And then actually it makes more sense to have your user interface in the middle, your reference monitor there, at least it's there, better than not having one at all. And then I normally put my scopes on the opposite side. And what that means is that actually I move my head back and forth a bit more. Again, is to alleviate neck pain. If you just fuse your neck like that and don't really ever move it, even if you're looking at these two, it really hurts. So I have my monitor, my scopes down and to the other side. So I'm actually moving my neck a bit. I even have software that will lock down my machine. So every hour it actually stops me from using it for 5 minutes, which forces me to get up and walk around and stretch and stuff. You know, open up the blinds, get some natural light in your eyes. You know, I think these are important things to kind of keep moving. Maybe it's because I'm fast approaching 40 that I'm more concerned with this than I probably was in the past, but trust me, you'll live to regret it if you don't do it. Right, I think that's probably enough about suite calibration and setup. Let's have a look at a few examples of the actual color grading workflow itself. And actually the first clip I'm going to start with actually isn't Cinema Raw Light. I've deliberately used actually a really rubbish 8-bit 420 mirrorless camera. I think it's the original A7S that I'm using here because I want to show how you have to treat things when they are not data rich. And then we'll move on to some of the other stuff that I'll demonstrate with a much higher quality codec. So with that in mind, let me share my screen. And I'm going to cut from a lovely picture of myself to the clean output of my interface. And I'm actually doing that by just taking the HDMI out from my Ultra Studio 4K Mini, which would normally go to my client reference monitor. I'm actually just taking that feed, looping it background into my ATEM Mini Pro so that I can cut to it as an angle. So you're actually getting the clean 10-bit output feed from DaVinci Resolve, which is lovely. So we've got this clip here. It's as I said, 8-bit 420 from a mirrorless camera, and it's well, you can see it's got some areas of clipping in it. Let's get our waveform up, and you can clearly see that we've got these areas of clipping at the top. The first step when you're color grading is always contrast. Contrast is by far and away the most important aspect. The reason for that is that we're incredibly sensitive to contrast and changes in luminance, and relatively insensitive to color changes. So we're always going to prioritize our contrast over our color adjustments. They always get made first. That's also pretty relevant if you're not using Resolve, or even if you are, but particularly in things like Premiere, Final Cut, they work in an RGB world only, whereas DaVinci Resolve works in a YRGB world. What that means is if you are making brightness adjustments in Premiere and Final Cut Pro, you are actually also making well, you're actually doing that by lowering and raising the RGB values, which if I just show you in the vector scope. So I can make it work this way in Resolve, but I can choose not to. But in these other programs, you have no choice. You always work this way. You can see as I'm adjusting the contrast here, you can see the saturation going up and down. And that shows you that I am, in fact, adjusting the red, green, and blue values. So it's the color signal that's being manipulated. Whereas if I wanted to make an adjustment that didn't affect my colors, my saturation, then I could do a Y only adjustment in my primary bars. So you'll notice when I do this that there's no oh, sorry, I didn't put my watch on silent. Someone from France calling me. That's exciting. Let me just put my watch on silent. Sorry about that. So you'll see that there's no, although the contrast is changing, there's no there's nothing like the impact on the color signal. If you're grading in Premiere or Final Cut or other programs, then you're probably making an RGB adjustment. So that's another reason to always start with the contrast, because it will have an impact on the saturation of your image, which actually, and the reason why you have a choice in Resolve, because actually that's quite useful in the case of a log image, because we want extra saturation in there anyway. So the key thing that we're trying to achieve in the early stages then is just balancing our contrast. And that's really simple if you've got something like a chart. Here you go, here's a chart from, this is actually the chart that I took for the C300 Mark III review that I did a few weeks back. So if you've got a chart, that's great, because you have a reference for black and you have a reference for 90% white. And so it's really useful for balancing out an image when there's a chart. But if there is no chart, which is more often the case than not, you have to be sensible about where you're placing your black and your white points. And that really is the whole purpose of this initial step. These initial steps are known as a primary grade. And it's a grade that affects the whole image and broadly starts moving it in the right direction. Now, with something like this, where I've actually got clipped highlights, it essentially, by de facto, means that where I currently am is the safest place to leave my highlights, because if I go up any further, I'm just going to clip more and more of the image. So I'm essentially kind of hamstrung there because of the exposure. In my defense, I overexposed this image because I was meant to. I was told to. This being an A7S. God, when did I shoot this? At least 5 years ago, probably more. It was the recommendation, and still is the recommendation of Sony, that I overexpose this image in order to clean up what would have been very noisy shadows down here. So I've managed to avoid the dreaded noise down here from that camera, but at the expense of my highlights, you can see it's clipped. So in terms of normalizing this image and its contrast, that does slightly limit me with my highlights. It also raises another interesting point, which I didn't really talk about this morning, but it occurs to me now. If you're going to try and normalize this using LUTs, if we come into our standard, this was shot S-Log2, Sony S-Log2 to Rec 709. I'm sure this has happened to a lot of you. If you then try and use a standard LUT that's expecting a properly exposed image, obviously it's going to all go hideously wrong, because this image has been overexposed. 90% reflectance was exposed at 70 IRE, which is over by stop and a half or so, as recommended by the incredibly clever Alistair Chapman to expose these cameras to give you the cleanest shadows. So we've done it exactly as recommended, but of course that does mean that LUT's now completely useless. But it doesn't really matter, because you can just use your eyes. So we know where our highlights are. We know that our white point's up there. The next thing to decide is, well, what's the black point? Is there something black? And this is the difference between the black point and just the darkest thing in your image. If you have something that's actually black, great, stick it at 0. If you don't, and it's just dark, like for example, this big patch of moss here, that's probably the darkest part of the image. We can see it down here in our waveform monitor. Is this a black surface in real life? No, it's a rock with some moss on it. It's actually relatively light. It's dark because it's the sun's behind it, but it's not black. If I say that's the darkest thing, let's put it down at 0, you actually end up with this, which is a very dark, and we're losing detail in these blacks over here, because this actually isn't black. I've put something that's not black at black. So you have to be very careful when you're placing your black and white point, that you're actually preserving image detail where it should be, and you're not arbitrarily placing the darkest thing in your image at 0, because it's only things that are black that should live at 0. Again, hence why it's so easy when you're using something like that, because you actually have a black reference, and it just takes that guesswork out. But here we're going to kind of try and kind of feel our way through it. So my white's kind of dictated by the clip there. My black's dictated by how much detail there should be in this area here. And then I've got my gamma, my mids, if you like, my mid-tone, to kind of spread the weight of everything between. You can see my waveform, it's not really moving the black or the white point, it's shifting everything in between. And I think this image kind of is meant to be relatively kind of dark-ish, a bit more moody than it was. And very, very straightforward. So we're just going from here to here. So we're really just pulling down the blacks and just shifting the midtones down a little bit. But we're creating a general primary grade for the contrast to kind of place things sensibly where it should be. what I might do separately to that is I might then make contrast adjustments to actually change how we're getting from point A to B. So from that black point to that white point. Do we want a really contrasty look? Do we want something really kind of low contrast? I'm actually using the contrast and pivot controls here, but there's no reason why I couldn't achieve something similar by, in fact, let me just do it this way. There's no reason why I couldn't achieve something similar just using the standard curve. So I could kind of pull these darker blacks down, pull these brighter highlights across to try and just push up more of the image, and you're essentially expanding the differences between the top half and the bottom half of the image. Now the point where this transitions, so this is kind of this classic S-curve, this point where this transitions from the top half of the curve or to the bottom half of the curve, that point is known as the pivot point. And if I move that pivot point up and all of the control points further along up, then I change the weight of the contrast up the image, or if I go down. That's quite tricky to do with the curve graph, but that's what the pivot control does with the contrast. So this is something specific to Resolve that I think is very useful to have. So I can get to a much better place relatively quickly with this. So we can pivot up or down depending on what we're trying to achieve with the image itself. So let's say that we want something relatively safe, nothing too strong. Let's say about sort of there, a little bit more contrast. And I'm just going to bring in an extra node here just to push the saturation up as well, just an arbitrary amount. I tend to think with S-log2, 85% tends to feel about right as an initial kind of way of getting in the right direction. So we're going from here to here at the moment. This is our start point, both primary corrections. One's a primary correction with our contrast, one's a primary correction with our saturation. In fact, I'll label these just so that we know. And what I'm also going to do, just before I finish working with the contrast, I'm actually going to create an additional change over here, because primary corrections affect the whole image, which is what we've been using so far, but secondary adjustments target specific areas of the image. Now, often that's associated with some kind of creative intent, some kind of creative look, but secondaries can also be used to kind of support the primary. So what I'm going to do here, I'm actually going to create a parallel node just to keep these two adjustments kind of from an organizational point of view more than anything else, just kind of keep them nice and separated from my color adjustments over here. And I'm actually just going to do a gradient for my contrast, because what we've got going on with this image is the intention of the DOP, which was me. The intention was to use the symmetry of the path running up the middle, the symmetry of the rocks on the left, the rocks on the right, and the high contrast differentiation between the green background, and we've got her with her skin, complementary and contrasting colors, and we've got the light sort of very pale yellow dress with the white shoulders on them. The whole point is to kind of that your eye to be led towards her, but that's slightly being counteracted by the fact that because I'm pointing into the sun, I've got a little bit of lens flare. So the lens flare is actually making this left-hand side a little bit grayer. And you can see it in the waveform. If I take my colorize off just to make it a little bit more obvious, you can see this side is higher than this side. And what I'm going to do to address that, and just to help support my composition, is I'm going to turn a gradient power window on. And I'm just going to turn my highlight mode on so I can see what I'm affecting. The gray area will be protected, and the area where I see the image is the area I'll be affecting. And I'm just going to fade that off so it's mainly affecting over on this side. And you'll see, all I'm going to do is look at my waveform, and I'm just going to bring the lift down until this is matching my brightness over on the right-hand side. It's a very straightforward change. Oops, sorry. Let's do it this way. It's a very straightforward change, but it's actually helping balance that image out. It's helping us, helping not lose our frame of reference over from where we want it to be. So it's now, because this and this are equal, it's funneling you and it's supporting that symmetry that was intended in the first place. And big part of color grading is trying to support the narrative or the intention of the composition or the lighting as well. let's come back out of there. So we've got our contrast adjustments here. We've got our saturation. I'm actually going to do another parallel node, just to, again, just organizationally, just to kind of keep these separate and visually kind of distinctly separate. And I'm just going to type in skin here. So I'm just going to deal with her skin. We're getting an awful lot of reflected light from the foliage back onto her skin. And I want to deal with that. And I'm just going to deal with that by just pushing in a little bit of magenta. Remember, magenta is opposite on the color wheel from the color that we're trying to get rid of. Actually, I probably want to go more sort of here because it's a slightly limey green. And I'm just going to move my color just over there. Not much. It's a very small change, but it's just slightly pulling out that green from my midtones, which is where her skin lives. And also it's helping with the soil on the ground. And it's just helping that separation a little bit better for the subject. So if we're moving from here now to here in a pretty straightforward way, let's close down my open effects, and let's maybe at the end here tie this all together with a kind of a look. So we're going through our primary correction, contrast, primary correction, color balance. We've also got a little secondary in here. We could start to expand these secondaries if you wanted to, and I might do them down here. So for example, I might create another parallel node, and I might start to think about possibly bringing the viewer's attention more towards the kind of the vanishing point at the end here. So I might, for example, do something like this and just really soften that off, and you know, maybe increase the contrast even further. So and maybe even the saturation even further. You know, try and kind of really draw attention to this part of the frame. And then I could even do like an outside node. So if I hit Option O, I can do an outside node, which is now inverting that alpha channel. And I could maybe on the outside of this, I could maybe just lower the saturation just slightly, maybe lower the contrast just slightly. So these two actually are together, just kind of slightly trying to pull your vision here into the middle of the frame and away from the edge of the frame, just a touch. So secondary adjustments, like we've got here, here, and here, they're all supporting the intention of the image. We've got the primary adjustments for our tint and our color. And then all of that foundational work, it's, you know, it's getting us to a point where if we, in terms of continuity, which we'll deal with separately, you know, this is relatively straightforward for me to kind of match. If I'm now like, you know, cutting to other shots from this sequence, it's going to be relatively simple to match that. If you go headlong into creating a creative look straight away, and you're doing all this work in one or two nodes, it actually makes it much more difficult for you to pick it apart and try and match from shot to shot. You know, broadly speaking, if I've got other shots that have been exposed similarly, white balance similarly, I should be able to take this framework and build upon it very easily. And for that reason, you want to keep the early stages of your color correction pretty straightforward. So we've kind of built up gradually, and then think about any kind of creative look, anything distinctly different from the reality of what we've got here as something that happens right at the end of the process. So if I create a new node at the end here, and we'll just call this look. Let's pretend this was actually from a horror film. And what I'm going to do here is I'm actually just going to try and push these sort of lovely, vivid, fresh greens that we've got here, these lovely spring greens, which to me kind of make things feel all lovely and sense of renewal and new life. And let's pretend that we really didn't want that because this is meant to be a horror film. I'm just going to go to my hue versus hue controls here. I'm just going to take a sample from one of these lovely vivid greens that we've got. And then I'm simply going to just adjust that. Let's just increase the width of this selection here. I'm just going to adjust that. Hang on. There we go. Just to kind of push it round. So it's just that little bit closer to orange and red. I could go really far with it, but I think something maybe a bit like that. It kind of gives it a slightly more sinister look. But you'll notice how clean that is. That hue versus hue adjustment is a very clean way. Remember, this is 8-bit 420. Yeah. So if I tried to actually key this, it would be an absolute nightmare. And I've tried it. You know, it just doesn't work. It's very, very difficult, if not impossible, to try and do a qualifier on just her skin or just her dress or hair. There's far too many similarities with here, but hue versus hue, I think it often gets overlooked. It's a very quick way of making these sorts of adjustments. And you can see how far we've kind of come with this image in relatively few steps, but leaving that kind of creative look until relatively kind of further down the process. The other important thing, of course, about hue versus hue controls is that there's no tracking involved. So we can quite happily sit back and watch this without having to worry about tracking objects. And as I say, 8-bit 420, this would be almost impossible to try and key out these areas and qualify them to make these adjustments. So sometimes the simplest solution is the easiest one. There's a little bit just where here, like just getting a little bit of green around her hair. We could almost certainly refine that by adjusting this control point here. And this is where it's useful to have the vector scope open and actually just make very small adjustments to the enclosing controls. So we can just make sure that we're not getting too close to her skin. We're just dragging this out, and actually, there you go. You can see that's now gone from her hair, still not in her skin, and we've just protected ourselves really quickly. Keeping an eye on the vector scope and just hot scrubbing through the input hue just to slowly widen our selection and watching carefully down here. We can do that in a couple of different ways. I'll give you a separate example of that in a minute. So there's our creative look anyway. We could even come up with a different idea. So we could maybe duplicate this as a version and try going in the complete opposite direction. Let's see what if we sent her to some distant foreign alien world or something. Maybe she's now on Pandora. Getting a little bit ropey with our separation now, maybe push that a bit too far. But there's definitely because this is a memory color, foliage is a memory color, we actually don't have to make very, very big changes to it to actually make people feel a bit uneasy. So that's not far at all from our original, but you can see it makes a big difference. You don't look at that and think that's normal. That looks clearly odd and almost otherworldly. And yet actually we've only moved it a very short distance. So, we've kind of got like our, if you like, our sort of horror look and our fantasy look and whatever you want, whatever your creative desires are. Okay, let's talk about skin. I've got a shot here. This is from a spec commercial that we shot just before the lockdown for Pucker, which was the basis of a training series we were doing with light panels, actually. And similar idea. Let's just start off by, actually I'll colorize this. Let's just start off by placing our black and white points. Now, one of the things that you'll want to be careful of here is, and this is much harder with this image, is that idea of pinning our black and white points. We want to make sure that we're not getting anything wrong. We want this to look kind of accurate. And that's very tricky because in this case, we don't have anything black or white. Again, really simple when you've got a chart. Here, we don't even have a dark rock like we had in that last example. We've basically got a light kind of creamy colored wall and skin. Yeah, there's black in maybe her pupil there, maybe right up her nostril. Apologies, Tara, I hope you're not watching this. Those represent such small parts of the frame. In fact, there's so few pixels that are down near black. What I've done to help me is I've turned on my extents here, and the extents just draw a little line around the full weight of the scopes, including the pixels you can't really see very clearly on the scopes. Like if you look at the bottom here, it's very tricky for me it looks like that's quite high. But actually with the extents on, you can see those tiny little pixels that do represent true black. I have actually placed those at 0. There's a few sort of brighter pixels here just in the reflection in her eye. They're just sort of sitting up around about 90. We could possibly go a little higher. And like the bulk of her skin, she's Caucasian. The reflectivity and luminance of lighter Caucasian skin tends to fall around this kind of 70 to 75 IRE, which is more or less where we are, falling away. You know, I'm pretty comfortable that feels like a nicely exposed image. So we've got our log image and our primary balance contrast. Let's label it. Let's call this balance. Oh, I can't type. There we go. And again, let's just maybe do a separate node for saturation. Now, where do you place skins for saturation? Caucasian skin in terms of lightness, it's kind of at 70, 75. Obviously, depending on the ethnicity, if you've got someone with darker skin, it's going to come further down. If you've got someone with deep kind of African black skin, it's going to be right down here in this kind of 25 IRE kind of area. So you've got quite a broad range there for lightness of skin. In terms of saturation of skin, if I go to my vector scope, and I've just got my 2x zoom on, so that outer boundary is representing 50% saturation now. And I think, you know, a normal kind of level of saturation for Caucasian skin, as we have here, is normally placing those skins. So that, just to be clear, this is the wall. So it's a very similar color to her skin, but less saturated. You can see that here, more yellow. This is her skin, and this is her lipstick here. So actually there's a bit of a color problem that we're going to deal with in a moment. But just in terms of saturation first, I really want a normal level of saturation for Caucasian skin would normally fall around about the kind of 35 to 40%. So remember, this is 50, so we're about 25 at the moment. I reckon somewhere around about there is relatively normal. It does depend on the context of the scene, obviously, but relatively to be expected for this type of skin. That means that my lipstick here, which is a nice sort of rouge, is actually roughly the same amount of saturation as the 50% saturated Rec 709 reference. I don't know why that's relevant. I'm just going to say it anyway. So anyway, that's my saturation. Let's maybe do a separate little bit of work here on the tint. So this isn't quite right, because here's our flesh tone line, and you can see the bulk, the main weight of her skin is actually over on the yellow side of it. That's quite far. A little bit to one side is absolutely fine and normal, but most of that is actually over here. You know, this is, we had a proper makeup artist on this shoot. I'd be surprised if you know, this has gone that far away. So what we can just do, I'm just going to do a little bit of a hue rotation here. I'm just going to rotate the hue of the whole image just a touch, just so that the skin is actually sat more, you know, kind of straddling this line. And if we just turn that off, you can see we're going from here to here. It's more sort of sitting on the flesh tone line. And actually, if you look at before and after, you can see it does look kind of slightly yellowy green, actually. And sometimes you need that before and after comparison to really trust your eyes. Of course, you also need a calibrated screen. If your screen isn't calibrated and you're looking at a vector scope and it's saying, ah, yeah, those skin tones are spot on, and then you look at it and goes, well, it looks green, or it looks this, or it looks that, and it doesn't look like it's meant to, then, you know, this is why we calibrate our screens, so that we take away that guesswork and we can trust our eyes. So again, we haven't done a huge amount to this. We've just done our color, our contrast balance, pushed some saturation in, and just added a little bit of a tint just to kind of the whole image. Something that we might choose to do in terms of secondary work. So if I do my secondary work over here, I might choose to maybe bring this wall back a little bit. When you're dealing with skin, as I said, there's a very delicate balancing act with saturation. If I feel like I want her skin to pop out more, the wrong thing to do would be to saturate it even more. The right thing to do would actually be to look at reducing the saturation of the other objects in the frame. So by comparison, her face seems more saturated. We have this little blob here from the wall. Let's maybe try and pull this back a little bit. So I'm going to go to my hue versus sat controls here. I'm just going to click on the wall, and that gives me these enclosing control points. And I'm just going to drop my saturation down. And normally I do this all the way down, just so I can more easily see the change that I'm making. And if we look, we can see we're still getting like half the wall has been captured there and half of it hasn't. So it's clearly, you know, again, it's a balancing act between getting her skin tones and getting the wall. So I'm just going to select this enclosing control point here, and I'm going to very slowly hot scrub through my input hue, and I'm going to stare just here and make sure that I don't start nibbling away too much at the skin. So actually we start getting the skin about there. We're just starting to get the skin there. So if I just back off a little bit, and you can see that's mostly just the wool, just starting to nibble the skin. But don't forget, I've made this 0% saturation. I've deliberately done it an extreme amount. So I'm actually just going to come back and select this control point here. And I'm just going to bring this back up. So we're actually, that's where it was. And I think we probably want it somewhere about there, about half of what it was. So all that's doing is that's just cleaning up a little bit these, the wall here. And it's by comparison making her look far more present in the frame without me just pushing up her skin. You know, you want to be really careful. You don't want the skin to kind of like glow and sort of be phosphorescent. That's really not the best approach. We can do more work actually if we do another node just called a skin. Her skin's actually great. You know, the colors are perfect. The makeup artist was very good, really happy with the skin. But let's say that she had, you know, maybe she was feeling under the weather, maybe she just got back from a run, maybe she had high blood pressure, who knows? But let's say that she's got some like pinky areas, and you do tend to get more pinky areas on cheeks and foreheads. Let me cut back to my other camera. The reason for that is that in these areas, so on your cheeks and in the middle of your forehead, your skin is much thinner and the capillaries are much nearer the surface. And that's where we flush, that's where we blush when we get hot. So you are always, even if you're not flushed and you're not hot, these are always more pink than these areas. So the more sort of jowly areas under the chin and the neck, sides of the head. There's less blood vessels, so you've got more of that yellow coming through from the melanin in the skin and less of the blood, the red from the hemoglobin. So you've got this more yellow areas here. That's normal. That's why we straddle the flesh tone line, because we've got sort of stuff on the left of the flesh tone line, stuff on the right of the flesh tone line, and then the transitionary point between them. If that difference is quite big, then you know it might be that they're very pink, they're very flushed. Then you can use a couple of different techniques. So for example, if I just take a qualifier here, I might say qualify the more yellow parts of her skin. So if I click down here, you can see these are the, actually, wrong side. Sometimes you have to click around a few times until you get the color that you're after. I think, actually, yeah, I think actually the yellows, oh, well, that was about as yellow as it got, really. Maybe we'll go the other way then. Let's try and pick the more pinky parts of her skin. So if we kind of click, there we go. That's quite a good one near the nostril. You can see the pinks that you get. Oh, there you go. There's some yellows. And actually the opposite way around to what I said they were, which is weird because that it shouldn't be the case. Oh, hello. There's a big nose zooming in there. That's unusual. Anyway, this image is a really bad example because actually the skin's fine. But let's say, there we go. Let's say that these pinks were too pink. What you can do is you can qualify those pinks, and then you can try and pull them round just using the hue rotation. You want to be very soft though, so whatever you're doing down here, you want to be very, very soft with it so that you're not getting anything too much from the image. You want to be really, really careful with it. And you know, we'll really soften off these. Let's maybe narrow the width and soften that off more. Try and get to those pinker parts. And what you can then do is you can just sort of rotate the hue round. So we can say, well, those are too pink. We can pull those round, just looking down at the vector scope. And then I can, you know, that should sort of normalize, if you like, kind of take away some of the harsher pinks. Okay, in this case, it doesn't actually, you know, it's not a look that I want. She looks a bit too monochromatic if I do that. But, you know, there's plenty of times where I've been grading people who, you know, sort of particularly older gentlemen, it tends to be, you know, far more pink in the cheeks. And this can be a really useful way of just reducing that discrepancy. Another way you can do this, which is less annoying, so let me reset this node. Another way you can do this is just take a normal qualification of the skin. So just take her whole face. I'll just do this very, very briefly. So something more or less like that, let's say, and then to use an effect. So Jake had Simon Hall on from Blackmagic yesterday doing a talk about the differences between Resolve, the free Resolve and the Studio. And one of the cool things about Resolve Studio is you have this color compressor here. And what you can do with that is you can target a color. So if I target, you know, let's say this kind of point here, let's say that that's the color I want her overall complexion to appear. And then I can compress the other colors. So if you look at my vector scope down here, you can see it starts to narrow those range of colors and compresses them. So they are now narrower. You know, if I go too much, it's like done that. So if I probably just sort of do something in the middle, we can compress the saturation. So we can try and make it so it's less of a variation in saturation across the skin. As I said, because this image is actually fairly good to start with, it's not doing anything actually that I think I'd want to do. But this can be a real lifesaver when you're, as I say, working with people with a big discrepancy between the different sort of color tones that they might have. So let's close that down. And one other thing, actually, let's look back in here. There's also the there's these Resolve Effects Refine. There's another one if you wanted to kind of deal with this, you know, slight uneven. There's a few like sort of slightly uneven complexion here. That's actually, you could have covered that with makeup, but it would have involved a much heavier application. And I instructed the makeup artist to keep it very light and natural looking, because we were, the whole commercial that we were focusing our series around was about color management and accurate skin tones and stuff. So she could have done that, but it would have looked quite different from what we were doing. But there's this beauty refine here, which is quite useful for kind of taking away some of the bumps and lumps that we all have in our complexion, and you can wipe that all off, all on, or get a mix in between the two to try and kind of get it looking natural. There are a couple of different kind of beauty tools in here. Like, you know, if we were going proper beauty work, we would, you know, probably start going down the route of, let's do like a, we could probably do something like further down here. Try and find it. There we go. If we bring in the patch replacer, for example, if we needed to get rid of her nose piercing, we could carefully place our place a little control point over that, and we can actually track that with the effects tracker down here, and we can make it so that, you know, that's basically tracked out. This is where beauty work really slows down. So obviously we don't want to do too much of that, and we can refine it. But that can be a good way of hiding sort of things like, you know, tattoos and piercings and things like that if you need to in the image. So dealing with skin is, you know, kind of easy in one sense and sometimes really difficult depending on the needs of the project and the client that you're working with. Let's look at some continuity stuff. So here we've got, let's bring up the grade for this. So here's the grade for this. This is from the same spec commercial. We've got this graded shot here, and then we've got our next image that, you know, follows it in the sequence, and we need this to match. So sometimes, and this is where the importance of actually kind of color management in production, which is something I've talked about separately on CVP an awful lot. This is where this makes this much easier. So actually, if I just copy and paste the grade from the previous clip, it's pretty much spot on, and that's because of our, you know, attention to detail in terms of the lighting and the thing. And in fact, this whole sequence was shot to demonstrate color management of, particularly from a lighting point of view. So I'm not surprised that basically does the job incredibly quickly and easily. But let's just pretend that it didn't, and we were trying to match this. So if I just come back here, what I can do is I can use various different tools. So for example, I can grab a still from this, and I can, let's do it in here actually, and I can wipe that across my other image to try and kind of match the contrast. So if I come into my waveform, we can kind of see roughly where things are meant to be and where they are. So we can start to kind of broadly match up the contrast for our image. If we look at the colors, again, we can broadly start to line up. You know, there's that yellow, that blob of yellow makes it very easy for us to match. And another thing you can do is you can actually make the image wipe cover the whole screen. So you can then disable this. So we can actually hit, so either Alt W or click the button up here. We can actually just click that back and forth. And we can try and kind of check the way that that appears in our various different scopes. Trying to like pick out specific colors. So if everything looked more or less the same, but the yellow wasn't quite right, then what we could do is we could use those hue versus hue and hue versus sat controls. Now let's come to did I reset the wrong one? I did, didn't I? Oh, well, never mind. Let's do it this way. You can use those hue versus hue and hue versus sat tools. So for example, if everything looked right, except that, you know, let's actually have a look at one that is slightly different. So that, oh no, that is basically, they're basically identical. I've done too good a job. Let's pretend that this yellow is wrong. What we could do is we could use our hue versus hue. We could just click on that yellow. And as we start to move it around, we can actually see that being manipulated. If we have our image wipe on at the same time, let's just wipe that across. Then as we're making that adjustment, we can actually see where it sits in comparison to our reference. You can see that's too far towards red, that's too far towards green, and that's exactly where it should be. So you can use this technique to essentially match those shots pretty much exactly. One of the things that I think really definitely benefited from this kind of methodical approach recently was sorry, I'm messing around whilst I'm talking. I was asked to grade a 2-minute sequence, which was just lots of different takes of a model on an orange background. And the client, this was a project that came in to just grade it earlier this week, and the client had sent a reference for what color the orange should be. And we had talent, so we had skin, and we had the talent in a white jumper. And there were 25 shots over 2 minutes, lots of different takes of her doing different things in front of the orange background, different kind of ways of turning around. And the intention was to normalize, but then also to make sure that continuity-wise, every single shot was identical. So by creating 3 different nodes, one targeting the jumper, the white jumper, one targeting the skin, and one targeting the background, in conjunction with an overall timeline grade, which normalized the balance, the contrast balance and saturation across all of them, we could then go in at a clip level, and individually I could tweak and make sure that the jumper was white in every single one. And looking at the vector scope, you could tune the, using hue versus hue, using hue versus sat, or isolating it with a key, you could actually tune every single different part. And there were 25 shots. The whole thing was 2 minutes long. And, you know, I think it ended up taking about 2 or 3 minutes to do the overall balance for the whole thing, because it was a timeline-wide adjustment, so that the main balance was done. And then it probably took about another hour to actually go through methodically and just checking every single shot. So all of the luminance and all of the saturation and the hues of every single element were all exactly the same. And when we finished, you could look through the entire sequence. You could scrub through the whole sequence, and the vector scope was just steady, and the waveform monitor was steady. There was barely any variation from shot to shot, which of course is exactly what they wanted, what they were paying for. So we then delivered that back to them, back through the portal, the website for Just Grade It, and one presumes that they then went through and actually took out their selects and carried on, you know, with the commercial that they were creating. I'd be interested to see the final project actually. So yeah, so this kind of continuity pass, it actually doesn't have to be too difficult as long as you know what you're doing. It's obviously much easier with a more robust codec, because you can actually qualify things much more easily. But it's all about meticulously paying attention to your scopes, really understanding what your scopes are showing, identifying features that appear in those 2 shots or more than one shot, and making sure that they're in the same space. There's also that final pass, which is also really important, that you actually just look with your eyes and you just watch it in unfolding at real time, the way your viewer will see it. I always remember grading something where I'd graded the interview. There was 5 different interview clips, clips from the same interview that appeared throughout the sequence. And I went through and graded all those interviews by grouping them together and then grading them as a batch, because it's much easier to get them all to match if you're just looking at those. So Resolve's hidden everything else, and I'm just grading the interviews. And they were all exactly the same. They're all absolutely identical. Went back, graded the rest of it, sat back, watched it through on our reference monitor. And when it came to either the last or second to last interview, I'm watching it and it looked really magenta. And I thought, hang on, that doesn't make any sense. Something's gone wrong. Maybe disabled a node by accident. Went back in, had a look, went back to the group, looked at them side by side, all identical. So then I looked at the wider sequence, and the shot, the bit of B-roll that's just before this particular interview, was a shot of some sunlight filtering in through some leaves through a tree. And it's just on screen long enough to actually slightly weaken your green receptors in these middle wavelength cones in your eyes. And when they get weakened, you get a dominance of the opposite color on the color wheel. So opposite there, you've got magenta. So because the green is weakened, it made the shot look more pink than it actually was. And that was just happening in my eye. It wasn't happening, if you looked at the scopes, completely, dispassionately, just going by the scopes, it looked accurate. But when you actually watch it with your eyes and take into account the functions of vision that affect all of us, it looked wrong. So I had to actually deliberately grade that shot to be more green so that it appeared to be correct once you saw it in sequence with those other shots. So all of these things have to kind of be taken into account when you're going through and working with color. It helps, obviously, if you're working with really robust codecs. The cinema raw light that we've got here, I mean, there's so much information, and this is 444 full color information. These were shot at 50 frames, so they're 10-bit, but I think this stuff was shot 12-bit. You've got a huge amount of color information in there, and so your keys are much better. It makes the whole process much easier. You can do more with the image. Having said that, if you know what you're doing, you can actually get away with fairly major adjustments, even on 8-bit 420 footage, depending on how well it's been shot and how well you're treating it, basically. Okay, I think that's a fairly good rundown of everything I wanted to run through. So now I'm going to open up Discord and let's have a look and see. Let's stop sharing that for a second. Come back to here. Can you see me okay, Jakey boy?
Yeah, all good, mate.
Yep, okay, fine. Right. How would you go about smoothing skin? Thoughts on finding the right skin tones? Okay, well, the smoothing thing I think I demonstrated. So hopefully that answered your question about that. There is also, actually, let me share my screen again. There is also, it's a lot more options, but therefore a lot more places to kind of go. Let's just grab another node. There is also the face refinement. What face refinement does, and I doubt it will work actually with this shot because she's looking in the wrong direction. Probably. I'll be amazed if it does work. So the face refinement, what it does is it analyzes the face and it finds the eyes, nostrils, lips, and then it allows you to actually completely adjust independently. Things like blush, lips, eyes, nose, brighten this, darken that. There's huge amounts. So there's eye retouching, lip retouching, blush retouching, forehead retouching, cheek retouching, and chin retouching. Is that because I've... don't know where the overlay's gone. Maybe it just didn't find anything. Maybe that's the point. Yeah, I think it's just not found the face at all, so it's not actually worked. But anyway, if they're looking at the camera, it's a reasonably good job normally, particularly for interviews, to actually, you know, have a huge amount of control over these functions. But if you're in a hurry, then I really think that beauty effect is very good. You know, the beauty work in color grading is a whole separate skill. There are people who are dedicated to just this work, normally in things like flame, to be honest. But I think, you know, the tools that are in there, that they might be good enough. You know, this I think this doesn't look too bad. I mean, actually, that's way too aggressive. I think I forgot to turn the blend down a bit, but you know, it does a fairly good job of just gently softening that image off. I don't think it looks too much like we've actually done a lot of work to. It's just slightly taking the edge off. I think you have to be careful with edge contrast, making sure that you're not losing the contrast where you want the contrast. But I think it does a fairly good job. So hopefully that answers that question about smoothing the skin tones. In terms of finding the right skin tone, I mean, you don't really need to find it. It's just, it is what it is. As I said, it's fairly, you know, it's fairly predictable. Everyone's got slight different complexion, but they tend to fall in the same place, to the point where on the X-Rite charts, they've actually got skin tone references for various different kind of ethnicities and darknesses and saturation levels. But if you qualify these, if you actually key these, and look, well, you can see it here. Let me just expand this for you. No, it's going to expand it onto a screen that I don't have connected, isn't it? Okay, no, I can't expand that for you. But you can see they're all clustered around the flesh tone line there. So if you're looking for a reference for skin, then that's what's useful about these particular charts. Cal, Ollie's opinion on grading panels. So Cal is looking at the Tangent TK and the Blackmagic Micro. They're around the same price, or even the Tangent Ripple, if it's worthwhile for saving some pennies. Would prefer not to be lusting after an upgrade after 6 months and just get the correct kit from the offset. Yes, Cal, very good points. Yeah, I have used the Tangent products. I've never used the Ripple. I have used the bigger Tangent ones, the TK, and the ones that you bolt together. That was actually part of the specification for a kit out of not the current, but the older YouTube space in London, which Google run. They commissioned me to set up the color grading suite there. So I did all the consultancy for the color grading suite that they had there. At the time, that was, you know, one of the options. This was quite a few years ago. That was kind of the best product without kind of spending an absolute fortune. And I have to say, I was never 100% satisfied with it. It was certainly better than the old Avid artist panel that I used to use with color, going back many years. That was kind of repurposed. It was bought by Avid and repurposed, or bought by someone else. Anyway, it was the flaky as hell. The connection was really bad. It was you'd spend 10-15 minutes trying to get it to connect. So it was the step up from that with the Tangent. But I have to say, it wasn't until that Blackmagic brought out their own micro and mini panels that I really suddenly felt like I had a proper functioning, dedicated control surface that I could just work on. And some people see it as a restriction, the fact that you can't customize the sorry, I'll go back to my main camera. Some people see it as a restriction, the fact that you can't customize the panel with the Blackmagic ones. You can't kind of set up soft keys and such like. I actually think that's one of its strengths, provided you're happy to stick rigidly to what Blackmagic just sort of decided as the layout. But the thing is, it means that it doesn't matter where I go. If there's a Blackmagic panel, I will be using it as quickly as if it was back in my own studio. We've got both the micro and the mini. We have the micro for when we were out and about and grading with laptops, and that was instrumental in, I did a 2000 nit HDR grade with the C500 Mark II sizzle reel for Canon on their stand at IBC last year. And Brett got me the proxies to grade from to edit from, and I edited that from my laptop on the Eurostar on the way over to Amsterdam. And then when I got to the hotel, Canon had already sent ahead the reference monitor, the 2000 nit DPV 3220 or 3221, can't remember, and had the micro panel. The micro panel only takes power over the USB-C. There's no separate power supply, which we knew was going to be an issue with the obviously local power sockets not being the same as our domestic ones here. And yeah, did that from my laptop. So if we're mobile, that's a really useful one to have. But on our main suite here, I've got the mini panel because that adds the additional secondary adjustments on the top section. And I do think it's worth the extra money. I seem to remember that I got it for a pretty good price as well through CVP. It's always worth speaking to an account manager or speaking to someone in sales. There's normally a little bit of a deal that can be done. Maybe I shouldn't be saying this, Jake. I don't know, but
yeah, no, you're 100% way better off going through one of our account managers than the website. You'll get a much better experience.
I think I go through the website when I'm in a hurry and it's relatively low value. But if it's anything that's significant amount of money, then it's worth speaking to the guys there, because you do get often a better price. So I can't remember how much I paid for our mini panel, but it was really good, and it wasn't anything like the RRP. So I love the Blackmagic ones. So that's the short answer is I would stick with the Blackmagic ones, presuming you're using Resolve. If you're not using Resolve, then don't. You've misunderstood. They don't work with anything else. Any other books you would recommend after reading the Bible, Color Correction Handbook? Also touching on laptops, new MacBook Pro 16, or are there any PC laptops? I don't know about PC laptops. I don't use Windows, and I haven't done for about 25 years. So I'm well out of the loop with Windows desktops and laptops. I've got the new MacBook Pro 16-inch. I was running at BSC this year. Back in late January, I was demonstrating live HDR grading on that same 32-inch 2000 nit HDR monitor of Canon's on Canon stand, and the whole thing was being run. I had my panel. The whole thing was being run just using my 16-inch MacBook Pro, and it kept freezing after about 4 or 5 hours into the day. It kept freezing, and I quickly realized it's because we had the laptop in a cupboard locked away, and there was no air holes in the cupboard, so that you would open up the cupboard and it was like the Sahara in there. So the heat was the only thing that was stopping us from carrying on longer. But provided you've got proper heat management and you're not doing it in a cupboard, you should find that the 16-inch MacBook Pro is pretty damn good.
In terms of like
any
Windows...
other resources other than the Bible? You're right. The Color Correction Handbook by Alexis Van Hertman is kind of the Bible for colorists. And I mean it as a massive compliment to Alexis, that his approach that he took with that book, I very much mimicked with my Mastering Color course on MZ. I wanted to create something that had that longevity by not being too focused on software and more focused on these larger conversations that we've had today, about contrast balance, about, color and tint and basic kind of color steps. So I hope future generations will refer to Mastering Color on MZ as the video Bible of online color correction, because I do think that Alexis's book is starting to get a little bit long in the tooth now. I mean, there are references to things that just aren't relevant anymore, particularly in terms of display technology. But I would say Mastering Color is a good one to look at. Okay, so that's on Discord. Jake, anything coming from YouTube or Zoom?
Let me just double check. I think the one question from Zoom is one we've answered, so that's fine. YouTube stuff, yeah, there's nothing else. Nothing else has come through.
Okay, that's fine. We had loads of questions this morning.
Yeah, I think there was I mean, we've still got 22 people watching on YouTube and a few on Zoom, so I think there was slightly more yesterday.
It's sunny outside.
But yeah, in terms of what Cal was saying about Windows stuff, it's difficult to recommend Windows laptops over MacBooks at the moment. They're still not quite there in terms of not saying that the MacBooks are robust, but the build quality is really good on them. And I think that, and obviously if people are used to the Mac ecosystem and how things work on OS X, prime example is Joe. Like, I've been trying to get him over to Windows so that way our workflow can be completely Windows for the past 2-3 years, and it's he's really stubborn. And the only thing he's stubborn about is literally just navigating around the actual operating system itself.
Yeah.
And I know that I used to use OS X back in the day, and it is a big difference, and it's weird to get used to it. I think for laptops, MacBooks are still great. They are expensive, but you're paying to stay within that ecosystem, I guess. And with the industry we're in, it is hard. It is hard to recommend going down the Windows route unless it fits in with like every other workflow that you do. It's difficult. if it
I'm
was
well out of
desktop,
the loop with it.
if it
I
was,
wouldn't.
yeah, it's a constantly evolving space. I mean, if it was a desktop computer, Cal, then I mean, you could easily build a computer that will absolutely demolish Mac Pros for fractions of the price. But again, it just comes down to where it fits in a professional workflow. You know, it's all well and good recommending something that's going to destroy it in a spec sheet, but if you're going to have issues in terms of stability and not being able to, I mean, they've only just added ProRes into certain exports for Windows. That was a huge thing for us at the beginning when we started doing our YouTube stuff, was trying to export as ProRes and just couldn't do it. They've changed it a little bit now.
ProRes is. I mean, that's been the ace up Apple's sleeve for a while, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
Really, really helped keep them a shoe in at a time where actually I think a lot of people were upset by them. But yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I don't know. It's a big question, isn't it? The whole kind of Mac PC thing. But we're very happy based around Mac. We've got the new Mac Pro, the 16-inch MacBook Pro. I just think that they're key tools in our workflow. I will upgrade them frequently to keep, because we're always pushing the boundaries of what we're doing. If we were just sitting back shooting HD on lower end cameras, not ever thinking about HDR, I'd save a fortune, and more importantly, I wouldn't have to upgrade so often. I seem to always be replacing. We've just got a new HDR monitor this week. The computer's only a few months old. Before that, the laptop, and this will all start changing soon. It's because we're constantly trying to kind of push and operate at that kind of furthest extreme, which is great, and that's why a lot of our clients use us. But it does put more pressure on staying up to date with certain things. So. Cal, I'm looking at the Flanders DM170/240. I can use it on set for my camera work and dual use grading at home, or should I use the Asus monitor you mentioned earlier? I guess ideally it's having the Asus as a user interface monitor in Flanders as well, which Studio for Pro monitor. So I've got at the moment, so this has just changed. I've now got two Asus. So I've got an ultra wide Asus for my user interface monitor, and I've got the Asus PA32UCX as my reference monitor, which is a 1200 nit HDR, 4K, mini LED, covers something like 88% of Rec 2020's gamut, which is, or at least that's what they state. I've actually done a fair amount of research because I didn't last time and jumped in with the Apple Pro display and then realized it was not fit for purpose. But I've done a fair amount of research this time, and quite a few people are measuring it, getting the panel actually measuring it as over 90% coverage of Rec 2020. So I think Asus have been quite conservative with some of their claims, but I'm super impressed. I would never have touched Asus in a million years. To my mind, it was like cheap kind of gaming PC equipment, and I've very, very much been swayed in the last kind of 6 months by hearing more and more good things about them. But the Flanders are amazing. I mean, you're always going to get a fantastic panel with them if you go the Flanders route. They're just so expensive. It's as simple as that. Just really expensive. And I think it's harder and harder to justify that cost. I think they've got great tools in them. Absolutely. I mean, some of the additional kind of tools that you've got in the Flanders are great. I love when I get the chance to use the Canon reference monitors. I love the built-in tools they have for that. The HDR false color on their new 2K HDR monitor is just incredible. Really, really useful for visualizing the HDR areas of your screen. Those are the sorts of things that you get on those monitors, and the kind of the longevity of calibration as well. But there are a lot of people doing really good things. Maybe the software is not as strong, but they're certainly doing good things in terms of the quality of the panel for much less money now. So it's an interesting time to be thinking about it. But the PA32 UCX I picked up on Amazon for $2,000 ex VAT, which is just stupid. I mean, that's stupidly cheap.
Yeah, for the panel you're getting, it's nuts. It's just the only thing, I mean, that monitor, I don't think I would not feel comfortable taking that onto a set.
Oh
If
God, no, no, no,
it's
no.
literally just gonna live at home and that's it. I would not take it anywhere
This
near.
came up in this morning's talk. This came up. I actually used to use the Atomos Sumo, the 19M, because that was our on-set production monitor. And I thought, well, I'd love to not have to spend more money and have this sitting around doing nothing when we're not shooting. So I actually had it hooked up with a VESA mount, and we had a C stand, and so we'd literally just come back in and just sit it. That's where it lived in the studio, and then it would be my SDR reference monitor. And if you set it to Rec 709, it's got really good calibration software built in that Atomos make that works with X-Rite's i1 Display Pro. So you just use a cable to plug it directly in, and it sets the internal firmware level 33-point LUT that it's got inside. So it actually is calibrating it properly. And I would calibrate it fairly often because I was constantly like, surely this can't be right, based on the money. But actually, every time I did calibrate it, it had never really drifted much, and it was perfect for SDR. It's a bit fiddly with the touchscreen controls to set it up. I seem to remember that it was about 8% brightness was roughly the equivalent of 100 nits for Rec 709. But I actually did that for a long time, and it worked perfectly well. You couldn't do it for HDR, unfortunately. The black points just weren't dark enough. But yeah, you'll be surprised what you can get away with. Yeah, the neon, I think we need to really look at and see. They seem to be promising a lot, but
yeah, I'm interested to see how they
really,
come out.
really see what they're capable of. Okay. Well, I don't want to kind of ramble because I'm likely to start landing someone. Oh, here we go. Look, what software do you use for calibrating? What setups do you use? Do you start from the previous calibration or from the factory X79? And how often do you calibrate? How often you calibrate is depending on the quality of the monitor. Canon's reference monitors, they actually they say that you shouldn't need to calibrate them more than once a year on their DPV range. The cheaper the monitor, the more frequently you're going to have to do it. Basically, I like the monitors that I've got now. They're at a point where I would. Well, there is it's an unknown quantity to a certain extent, so I'll probably do it relatively more often than I might otherwise. But I suspect I'll probably end up doing them maybe every 2 or 3 months. I use the X-Rite i1 Display Pro. In fact, if you get the UCX-K variant, that K, all that means is it comes with the probe. So you actually get a free i1 Display Pro with that monitor at the moment, and they're a couple of £100, which is pretty good value. Those probes are really good, I think, for the money. That there's nothing really between them and like the kind of the Kleins and the more expensive couple of £1,000 probes. So they're good value for money, and they're very well supported. In terms of software, if I'm doing my UI, I would just use the X-Rite software that comes with it, the display calibration software that comes with the probe. If I'm doing an external monitor, I use DisplayCal often, which is an open source software. I would love to use Light Illusion. I think Light Illusion is a fantastic product, but it's Windows only, which is really frustrating. If anyone from Light Illusion's listening, I know Sandeep, who works for Zeiss now, I think he's still involved with Light Illusion. Make a Mac version. But yeah, I use DisplayCal, which is you can get basically Resolve to send out a Calman pattern generator to any external display that's hooked up through an Ultra Studio, and then you can use your X-Rite i1 Display probe, and then you can use the DisplayCal software to take that and generate LUTs from it, and then you can load those LUTs in. There's some software that comes with my Asus, which is like meant to have tighter integration, but I haven't tested it. I literally just got them onto, but I was reading a review, someone saying that it didn't seem to give as accurate calibration as using X-Rite software. So who knows? Do I start from the previous calibration or from the factory? I always reset, always go back to the factory defaults and then build on the LUT from there. Cool. If any questions crop up after we've finished, then do carry on posting them. We will revisit these threads, particularly the YouTube thread, and we'll come back and we'll re-answer these. If you're on Facebook, there's a closed Facebook group called Coro Alumni, and that is for people who have either come to these seminars or I've trained in the past. Also somewhere that you can post questions. CVP's pages, obviously on the social media pages, wherever you can, just chuck these questions and we'll get to them, and we can answer any that come in after the event. But I suspect that's probably a good place to leave it.
Awesome.
You're welcome, Cal.
Awesome, mate. Cool. Yeah. Like Ollie said, any questions, let us know and we'll get to them. Awesome.
Great. Thank you, Jake.
Thanks,
Have a great weekend, everybody. And I will be back next Friday.
Week. Yeah.
Doing my directing colour, which will be my last webinar for CVP for a little while. So tune in.
Yeah, don't miss it. I think it'll be on YouTube, it'll be on Zoom. Either keep an eye on our social media on the day or sign up on the website to get the links. But yeah, thank you for joining us, guys. Everyone have a good weekend. Thanks,
Jake. Bye-bye.